All right, I'd like to welcome everyone once again to a Wildlife for You wildlife class. Today, we are going to be talking about an awesome topic. We're going to be talking about gray wolves. And I call them the icons of wild America. And you'll know why after we get into it. But most folks know about gray wolves, but there's a lot of misinformation that is out there. So hopefully I'm going to teach you a little bit or a lot of bit about gray wolves, and I am here for you to answer all the questions you may have. And so I am today's presenter. I'm Daryl Radijek. I am a wildlife biologist and large carnivore specialist. But what I always like doing, especially for the new folks that are on this presentation, and we do have a handful of new folks, we want you to know that whenever you attend a Wildlife for You class, we do have instructors that are fairly knowledgeable about wildlife. I shouldn't even say fairly, but very knowledgeable about wildlife. So we always ask them to present their background information. Now, today's class is being taught by myself, and most of you know who I am. Again, my name is Daryl Radijek. I am a wildlife biologist. I also specialize quite a bit in those large carnivore type of animals, but I do have my degree in wildlife management. I have worked as a wildlife biologist throughout my career, and I've worked in a number of places wore a number of different hats, but I used to work at a place called the Appalachian Bear Center in East Tennessee. I spent about 15 years working for the Tennessee Wildlife Resources Agency. I was their big game coordinator, so I was over bear and deer and elk. I was promoted to be the chief of wildlife in Tennessee. I did that for about 5 years. And then that yearning to move out west called me. And when you work for the state of Tennessee, the furthest west you can go is Memphis. And that's not where I wanted to end up. So I made the jump to the federal side of things and started working with the U.S. Forest Service out of New Mexico back in 2015. Did that for a while. And now I'm working for the Bureau of Land Management. And so I have been a wildlife biologist throughout my whole life. I've worked with these large megafauna that we like to call them. And so everything I'm going to present to you today is based on real science. I will back it up with anything that I have that you doubt. But this is not just like I slept in a Holiday Inn and I read a lot of books. I did read a lot of books, but I've dedicated not just my education, but my career to wildlife. So that's enough about me. And so we're going to jump into today's topic. And so this is the animal we're going to be talking about. And I got to set the stage. I got to set the mood for what it means to see these animals, and more importantly, to hear these animals. And so what I want to do is want you to just either focus on that, just sit still, be quiet. You can close your eyes for a second if you want, but I really would like for you to take a gander or have a listen. Imagine being somewhere quiet in the woods.
If you have an enlarged prostate, do this 15-second Japanese ritual before bed to shrink it almost immediately.
That's not what I wanted.
Nima Sharifi was awarded 1 million.
Now that was funny, and that was recorded. I'm trying to get my wolf howl. Okay, close your eyes. Stop thinking about your prostate. Close your eyes and pretend that you are in the middle of nowhere, and you get to hear this. All right. And just so you know, that was, I pulled that off of YouTube, and they are full of ads. So a wolf howl. if you've ever heard it in real life, hey, just curious, has anyone ever heard a real wolf howl? You can type in the chat box. When I ask you a question, it's okay to to type in the chat box. Yeah, bet cats usually react strangely to dog howls. Okay, not many people have heard it. I will tell you, I have not. I've been in areas where there was wolves. I've seen wolves, I've watched them, but I never had the luxury of sitting there at night and hearing them go off. But listening to those, if you Google wolf howls and you get yourself in the right mood and it's quiet, I don't know if you're a nerd like me, but I will get goosebumps listening to that. I think it's an eerily beautiful song, and it comes from a very often misunderstood animal. So what I want to do today is talk about this animal, the gray wolf, and spend some time getting more familiar with it and being in better position to answer question or ask questions about this wonderful, wonderful animal. So with that, I'm going to jump into are you seeing okay, there we go. I'm going to jump into today's presentation. So the first thing I want to do is make it crystal clear what animal we are talking about. And what it is, what we're going to be doing is we're going to be talking about a couple of critters in this family called Canidae, also known as canids or canines. And so there is actually a number of different species within this family of Canidae. And so there's species like even on different continents. So when you go over to Africa, there's jackals, which are in the same family. In Australia, you have dingoes. But here in North America, we're primarily dealing with foxes, coyotes, and wolves. These are the primary wild canids. Now, I will tell you there's another species out there, or subspecies out there, the man's best friend, which we all know and love as our dogs. But all those animals that you see there fall in this family called Canidae, or the canids. And like I said, you refer to them oftentimes as canines. One of the big things when you're dealing with this family is there is a lot of debate, a lot of argument, and oftentimes a lot of controversy. And why is that? It has a lot to do with hybridization, because sometimes these species are not as pure as one would believe. There's a lot of mixing and matching. And I'm going to get into that whole idea of hybridization here in a little bit. But I want you to know that for today's conversation, we are going to focus mostly, not solely, but mostly on this guy here. This is the wolf. And if you look at their scientific name, it's that binomial nomenclature. They go by Canis lupus. And what Canis lupus is, they're also known as, many people refer to them as gray wolves, but there's also some people that will refer to them as either Eastern or Western gray wolves. But Canis lupus, or the wolf, it also is known as the timber wolf. And believe it or not, even in the southwestern part of the country, we have what are called Mexican wolves. Now, it looks like there's all these different varieties of wolves, or gray wolves as we know it, and there actually is. Now, first and foremost, this map is not exact. It's a good demonstration of all the different kinds of, and I'm going to put air quotes on it, all the different kinds of wolves that there are. So looking at this map, hopefully you can see my cursor, but you can see all these different kinds. There's a Mexican wolf. There's a Northern Rockies wolf, a British Columbia wolf, Mackenzie Valley wolf, Eastern timber wolf. The thing that I want you to note, and I don't know how big of a screen you can see, but if you look at any of these, Mackenzie Valley wolf, it's Canis lupus occidentalis. So what that means is it's a variety or a subspecies of a wolf. So you go from Mackenzie Valley wolf to the Mexican wolf. Again, Mexican wolf is Canis lupus bailey. So all of these different groups of wolves that you see, they're all Canis lupus. They're all gray wolves. And so one of the things that I will tell you is this idea of speciation or subspeciation or variety causes so much confusion when it comes to this wolf discussion. Now, most people know wolves were reintroduced into that Yellowstone area back in 1995, and you will hear arguments that they didn't release the right species of wolf. And it's funny because I debate and I fight that argument all the time. If you look at this narrow gray sliver, that was the Northern Rocky Mountains wolf that was primarily found in Yellowstone. It was Canis lupus eremotus. Problem is, those wolves were completely wiped out. Man had done a great job of eradicating those wolves. And I shouldn't say great, I was being sarcastic, but they eventually wiped out all of that subspecies. And so what the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service did is they released this other variety, this Mackenzie Valley wolf, the Canis lupus occidentalis. And people are claiming that's that's a super wolf. It's so much bigger. It is not much bigger. Again, it is the exact same species. It's Canis lupus, but people get so hung up on what variety that these wolves are that they kind of lose focus in the fact that they are all gray wolves. So we're looking at that, and those are all the different varieties of gray wolves that we see in North America. So what about this guy? This guy, in case you don't know, he's a scrawny looking wolf. That is actually known as a red wolf, and they are very, very similar to coyotes. In fact, they're only slightly larger than a typical coyote that we'd see, but it is a wolf. This is known as a red wolf. Now, I will tell you, red wolves are almost completely gone from the wild in North America. Sadly, they were pretty much killed out. There's only a couple pockets left. And I believe in the early 1990s, it was declared that they were extinct from the wild. Now, there were remnant red wolves that were kept in captivity. And so the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service started a breeding program, and they were successfully raising red wolves in captivity. And they tried doing a couple of releases. One of the releases was my old stomping ground in Great Smoky Mountain National Park. Unfortunately, that didn't work. They were not successful at raising young, so they weren't reproducing. And so those red wolves were moved to coastal North Carolina. And at one point, about 15, 20 years ago, there was about 120 red wolves in coastal North Carolina. Sadly, that population has shrunk. It's now believed there's only about 15 or 16 red wolves left in all of North America. They're all along the coast of North Carolina. And so the Fish and Wildlife Service is going to start up their program again, try to boost those numbers and maintain that wild red wolf population. Now, if you want to know where those red wolves were located, this map is not great. I'm going to show you a better map that will show you where red wolves were located, but it was mostly in the southeastern states. Now, gray wolves, all those other wolves, you got to understand they're fairly large canines. They got big, thick, heavy coats. If you're living in Florida or Georgia or Alabama, you don't want to be wearing that big, heavy coat that's really well adapted to surviving cold weather. So that's why those red wolves were kind of designed to be a little bit more scrawny. They didn't have as thick of a fur coat as the gray wolves, but that's where red wolves historically roamed, was in the southeastern states. So let me dive in a little bit more about this speciation, or what I'd like to call subspeciation. So it's, for those of you that know me, it's a little pet peeve of mine because it confuses the snot out of so many people. So let's first talk about how speciation occurs. Now, if you are a long-term student of our wildlife classes, we give a lot of bear classes, you have probably seen this slide before, because there's this species of bear called the brown bear, but they can look vastly different. The brown bear on the left is what many people call a grizzly bear. And if you look at the brown bear on the right, that is a Kodiak bear, or a coastal Alaskan brown bear. And if you look at their scientific name, they're both Ursus arctos. One, that grizzly bear, the variety is horribilis. The other one is Middendorfi. And so the bottom line with that is they're the exact same bear. They are a brown bear. That is their classification. But because of geographic differences, one of those bears, that grizzly bear, which lives in the Rockies, is eating a fair amount of vegetation, insects, whatever animals they can scavenge, whether or not they're carcasses, or if they're lucky enough to take down a young elk or a young deer. That doesn't make up a large part of their diet. So they're mostly eating vegetable matter. The bear on the right, those Alaskan brown bears, are feeding on a huge meat source. Those salmon runs, they're gorging themselves on fish for 2 or 3 months out of the year. So they grow to look vastly different. That is what often causes this speciation, or the subspeciation. They might be the same animal, but they look different. So let's talk about this subspeciation in these wolves. And what is really interesting is it's not so much this geographic difference, but it's going to be a temporal difference that causes these different subspecies in wolves. So I'm going to take you back in time. We're going to go back in the late Pleistocene. So that Pleistocene era lasted from 10,000 years ago all the way up to about 1 million years ago. And at one point in time, there was no wolves in North America. This Western hemisphere, we didn't have wolf-like creatures. Now, there were plenty of wolves or wolf-like creatures over in the old world, what we call the Eastern hemisphere. So in Eurasia, Africa, that continent had a lot of wolf-like creatures. And so what happened in the late Pleistocene is you have what's called one of those ice ages, and these ice sheets come down. And what happened is that ice sheet created a link. It created this land bridge to go from the old world, like I said, Asia, and it created this pathway for wolves to move across and start inhabiting North America. So there was this wave of these wolf-like creatures hundreds of thousands of years ago that finally came into North America. So at this point in time, we now have wolves in North America. And so for a long time, again, we don't know the exact years or how long it lasted, but that first wave from that ice sheet brought wolves into this new world. But guess what happened again? Another ice sheet comes down, and we don't know how long in between, but it's a long time period, tens of thousands of years. And suddenly a new wave of wolves come from that old world, and they now come into North America once again. And those wolves were isolated, not just geographically, but over a long temporal period. And so they're slightly different. And believe it or not, this happens again and again. And to the best of our knowledge, there was 3 different events where this ice sheet allowed wolves from the old world to come into the new world, or what we call North America. And so because of this time frame when wolves kept getting access to North America, to the best of our knowledge, it is believed that is what caused a lot of this subspeciation between the wolves. So if you look at it, that first wave of wolves, those have been in North America the longest. And so if you look at the variety, this Canis lupus bailey, those are those Mexican wolves. So the ones that were furthest south. That other big batch of wolves, which again kind of isolated themselves, is this Canis lupus nubilis. It's what we call the Midwestern or Great Plains wolf. And then that other big batch of wolves is that Canis lupus occidentalis, or the Mackenzie Valley or Canadian wolf. And so that's why we have some of these differences in looks and appearance and size. Not great differences, but I found it utterly fascinating that the wolves came to North America in waves based on those ice sheets. And this was done through genetic testing, by the way. So not real important. I thought that was actually kind of interesting to know how they came to be in North America. Now, I will tell you that other variety that I mentioned earlier, our good old man's best friend or woman's best friend, Canis lupus, the variety there is familiaris, or sometimes you'll see it listed as Canis lupus domesticus. Dogs, the dogs that we all know and love, they are gray wolves that have just been selectively bred for tens of thousands of years. We have domesticated wolves for a long, long time. And because of the selective breeding, we can make dogs look crazy different than a gray wolf. Now, some dogs that we have, like German Shepherds and Huskies, they still have those traits that look very much like a gray wolf. But then you get into Labs and Pugs and Dachshunds and all sorts of crazy looking dogs, and that's all due to selective breeding. But they are the same family of wolves. They're still Canis lupus. And so bottom line here is it's a very complicated family. Whenever we're talking about Canidae, to know exactly what kind of animal we're talking about. Now, I will tell you just recently, and I know some folks on this call today have joined in, because there was some information shared on a Facebook page in which someone was talking about coy wolves, how they're not dominating, but they're found throughout the Smokies. And there was lots of questions about coy wolves and different articles posted on there. There's a lot of misinformation that was being shared. So I wanted to kind of explain this concept of coy wolves. Now, I imagine most people have heard that term. And usually when you're talking to the public and you mention the term coy wolf, it automatically leads people to believe it is the cross between a coyote and a wolf, as if their mother and father, one was a coyote, one was a wolf, and it created this 50-50 mix, and they call it a coy wolf. And that's what a lot of people believe, because that's what a lot of people have told me. And it's not like that. Now, I will tell you, I'm showing you the map, and hopefully you can see the cursor on the screen. But remember, wolves dominated pretty much all of North America. So most of the gray wolves were found throughout Canada and the western half of the United States. Those red wolves were found down in the southeastern states. Now, humans, especially the European kind that came over a couple hundred years ago to North America, they were really good at exploitation. Whether or not it was the trees or the wildlife or whatever, if we wanted to use it, we used it willy-nilly with no restraint. And unfortunately, in the case of many predators, besides there's this fear factor that they're going to compete with us. And it's true. They would compete. They would take our livestock. So these early Europeans waged a war on wolves, and they pretty much extirpated them from the whole eastern half of the United States. Now, believe it or not, the coyote 500 years ago was pretty much just relegated to being in the Midwest and in the Southwest. So they were more or less a plains animal. And so after we eradicated all the red wolves and gray wolves from the eastern half of the United States, the coyotes started making their way eastward because there was this empty niche. What used to be a large canine predator on the landscape was now gone. And the coyotes said, hey, there's more land over here that we can occupy. So coyotes started moving eastward. In that same vein, you still had gray wolves up in Canada that, again, they saw this unoccupied territory, and they could come down and occupy that vacant land that was left from extirpating all the animals that were there. Now, I will tell you, at some point, it is best estimated around the 1900s, there was a convergence of these wolves from the north, mostly around Ontario, in the province of Ontario, and they first came in contact with the coyotes that were moving eastward. Now, typically, coyotes and wolves stay separate. There's plenty of wolves and plenty of coyotes. They keep to themselves. They kind of limit each other. And just so you know, wolves will eat coyotes. But what happens is when there's only a few animals, so if there's only a few animals in that, a few wolves in the Ontario region, and they encounter only a couple coyotes, there's this thing that happens. And I could just imagine Barry White playing, because if you're one of the only wolves in that area and you're looking for a mate, and you can't find any other wolves in that area, but you see this wolf-like looking creature that might be a little bit smaller, again, the Barry White starts playing, and before you know it, you get some interbreeding going on. Now, remember, it's typically when there's not many animals on the landscape. And so I probably shouldn't say this, but it's kind of like a last call at the bar. You will take what you can find. And that's what the wolves and the coyotes did. And so there was some interbreeding going on early 1900s, and it created this area where you now have this animal. And a lot of people call them coy wolves. A lot of articles call them coy wolves. For the most part, they're mostly coyote. They did DNA testing, even though they're called coy wolves. The best way to refer to them is an eastern coyote. Now, these eastern coyotes have about 65% coyote mix in them. They have about 25% wolf mixture in there. And believe it or not, they have about 10% domestic dog in them. And so there's never anything that's really neat to say 50-50. And so most of these animals that people are calling coy wolves, they're mostly coyotes. And so we call them eastern coyotes. Really, really complicated. And I hate talking about it, but at this point, I'm going to stop here and just see. I won't last too long here, but I just want to know if anyone has any questions about any of the speciation, or where you find gray wolves, or where you find coyotes, or anything like that. So, okay, I do see a couple. And for I'm getting old, so I got to wear my old man glasses. Okay, Virginia asks, why haven't wolves moved to the east then? Well, they will. Wolves are expanding their population, but you have to understand, when that vacancy took place, there was a whole lot more coyotes on the landscape. Wolves were really, really persecuted. Wolves were almost completely wiped out of the entire lower 48 states. And so coyotes always kept a stronghold. I don't know why they weren't. They were still persecuted, and they were still killed for a number of reasons. But it's just that there is more coyotes that can start that movement eastward. Wolf populations are growing. We're going to talk about that, but it's a complicated issue, because whenever you get into the DNA, you're going to see these mixtures all the time. We like putting things in neat little boxes to say that's a purebred wolf, that's a purebred coyote, that's a purebred whatever. Oftentimes they're not purebred, but for the most part, we can make the determination that they're mostly wolf, mostly coyote. And like I said, this is why I hate talking about the subspecies, because it confuses the heck out of people. Virginia asks, what's the population of coy wolves roughly now? Number wise, I can't tell you that, Jenny, but I will say that they were just looking at the range, and most of these eastern coyotes or coy wolves from about Virginia all the way north to those northeastern states and through that eastern part of Canada. So that red circle that you see on the screen, that is where you're likely to see these larger, more aggressive, a little bit more wolf looking type of coyotes. As far as numbers, I don't have numbers, but that's where you tend to find them. So. All right, Susan says, why did they come in 3 distinct waves to North America instead of some packs of 3 different? I'm not sure I understand the last part of it. It had to do with, well, obviously with those ice sheets providing access to the New World. And so you have to understand, when that first wave came in, the wolves in North America were doing fine. The wolves in that Eurasia were doing fine. Being so geographically isolated, there might have been some differences that evolved over time. And then when that ice sheet came in, it allowed those old world wolves to move into North America again. And from what they can tell from the genetic work that they did, there was 3 different waves in which those old world wolves came into North America. And I'm not a geneticist. I know just enough to be dangerous, but I just found it really interesting in that there was this wave, at least three different times where wolves kind of came in and started redistributing throughout North America. Okay, Ginger asks, are these coy wolves in Cades Cove? The answer to that is no. As far as their spread, like I said, they're in the northeastern part of the country, and they've documented this coy wolf type of critter all the way as far south as Virginia. And so there's no evidence that they have spread out further. And all they are, remember, they're just a coyote. They just have a little bit more wolf genes in them, so they're a little bit larger coyote than the typical southern or western coyote. And so for the most part, the Northeast is where you're going to find these eastern coyotes, or what some people like to call coy wolves. Okay, I'm going to move on. This was the toughest aspect of it all, is trying to explain this speciation. So sit back, relax. Again, I'm going to teach you more about the wolf and get into the biology and behavior here in a second. Now, before I do that, I do want to tell you, wolves are doing fantastic. You hear a lot of stuff about endangered wolves. It depends on the area of the world you're in, but when you look at the worldwide population of wolves, that graphic there, you can see they dominate the northern hemisphere, so mostly north of the equator. And those green areas is where you currently find gray wolves. And so this Canis lupus. And if you think there's a lot of these subspecies in North America, wait until you get into the other parts of the world. There's even more subspecies, but they're all Canis lupus. They're all gray wolves. Now, what I find really interesting, and I'll touch back on this later on, but if you look at those red areas is where we kind of extirpated or eliminated wolves from that range. And the thing that you'll note, you see North America, we did a great job. And I say that sarcastically, but we did a job of eliminating wolves from the lower 48. But then you look, Europe has a lot of red. India has a lot of red. And so those areas, Japan is pretty much all red. So those areas that are red is where we have high human populations. There is not a really good tolerance of wolves amongst humans. And so unfortunately, we eliminated wolves from those areas of their historic range. So that's what it looks like worldwide. Well, what does it look like in North America? We all live in North America, so you want to learn about the animals here. So let's look at this map, and this is where we can start talking about numbers, actually. And so if you look at the map, hopefully, again, you can see my cursor, but this whole area that is colored, whether or not it's the light beige or the auburn, and I'm colorblind, so if the colors don't look like that, don't blame me. The darker brown area is where you currently find wolves, but this light beige area is their historic range in North America. The first thing that I noticed when I saw this, you see this big opening in the southeast. Why is that? That is because that is where the red wolves are. Remember, red wolves are a different species than the gray wolves. Unfortunately, we pretty much eliminated red wolves, and there's only a couple of them right on the coast of North Carolina. But historically, gray wolves dominated most of North America. Now, if we start looking at the populations, where do we find wolves? I'm going to break it up into a couple of different groups. So the first group that we can talk about is the Canadian wolves. So just think of the country of Canada and where you find them. Wolves are doing wonderful in Canada. It's estimated they have maybe upwards of around 60,000 wolves throughout Canada. And most, you can see they're still currently living throughout most of Canada. There's a couple of spots in the Great Plains where they're no longer there, but most of Canada has a healthy wolf population. So the next big group that you can look at is Alaska. Alaska, it's estimated they could have anywhere from about 7,700 all the way up to over 11,000 wolves just in the state of Alaska. So again, really, really healthy population. So you know they're doing well up in Alaska. But then we're going to drop down into the lower 48. And there's actually 3 distinct subpopulations within the lower 48. The first one is that Western Great Lakes region. And I'm so thankful we've got a couple of folks from 2 of those states, but you'll find these Western Great Lake wolves occupying parts of Minnesota, Michigan, and Wisconsin. And they're doing really well in those Western Great Lakes states. They estimate anywhere from 3,500 to about 4,000 wolves in those 3 states alone. Then we'll talk about another very prominent, highly publicized population, and those are the wolves in the Northern Rockies. So there's wolves in Wyoming, Montana, Idaho, Eastern Washington, and even in Oregon. There's a couple wolves that drop down in Colorado, but for the most part, these Northern Rocky wolves in the lower 48, the greater Yellowstone area, anywhere estimated from about 1,500 to 2,000 wolves, again, doing very well. And then last but not least, if you look at the map, there's this small population in the Southwest. Those are what we call Mexican wolves, but they're still gray wolves. They look a little bit different. They're really gangly. Obviously, it's going to be hot, arid, dry, and so you're not going to have a thick, lush fur coat. They're going to have much longer appendages and skinnier appendages. There's a couple of biological rules I won't bore you with, but they look a little bit different, but they're still gray wolves. And so that Southwest population right along the Arizona-New Mexico border, they're estimating about 120 animals of those Mexican wolves. So if you look at the total population, North America, we have anywhere from 70 to 80,000 wolves. Again, very healthy. They're not going extinct. They're not endangered from a global standpoint. They're doing quite well. So let us look a little bit at physical characteristics of wolves. Most people know what they look like. I think they're a beautiful, beautiful animal. And they will range from almost a pure white, especially those Arctic tundra wolves will have an adaptation where they're mostly white to help them blend in. But you also have wolves that can be almost completely black or all black. And then from that, you have a combination of everything in between with these mixed models of gray. And so, again, very beautiful animal, very different colorations, almost as cool as black bears, but not quite. but they're awesome looking animals with these heavier fur coats. And so they're very well adapted for this winter survival. So what about the size of wolves? And this is where a lot of misinformation comes in. This particular image has been floating around Facebook for the last week or so. Beautiful capture. Now, these two animals were not walking side by side. What it was a trail camera picture of a wolf, and then a trail camera picture from the exact same camera, exact same time of day. A different day, though, was a coyote. And so the photographer superimposed them, and is a great example to show you the size difference between a gray wolf and a coyote. And you can see from a mass standpoint, like body size, that wolf is about 3 times larger than the coyote. And so if you look at the details regarding the differences in sizes, you have a gray wolf, which obviously could be quite tall, anywhere from almost 2.5 feet tall at the shoulders. They can be about 5 or 6 feet long. The big thing here, though, is the pounds, 80 to 120 pounds. That's an average wolf. A lot of people are thinking wolves are 200, 250 pound animals. Now, some of them can be big, especially the further north you go, they can get bigger and bigger. But on average, the typical gray wolf is going to weigh about between 80 to 120 pounds. Females typically tend to be a little bit smaller than the males, but on average, they're not these 200-pound animals. Now, the coyote, on the other hand, like I said, much, much smaller, only about 1.5 feet at the shoulder, only about 4 feet long, but look at the size, 20 to 50 pounds. And so, excuse me, they're a much smaller animal. The big thing to tell the difference between the two, because sometimes when you're looking at a single animal from a distance, whether or not it's binoculars or telescope or just your eyes, excuse me, it may be hard to tell the size. And so you have to look at different body characteristics. And the best thing to do to differentiate between a wolf and a coyote is looking at that snout. The snout on a coyote is very narrow, almost pointy like. They also have these tall pointed ears. The wolf, when you look at their face, their snout is usually much broader. I was trying to think of a domestic dog, but their snout is much, much broader than it is on a coyote. Like I said, the coyote's snout almost looks pointy compared to that wolf snout. And again, typically, if you have a good gauge of size, you can tell which one is which, but sometimes from a distance, you got to look at some of these other characteristics. Now, I will tell you, and I warn people of this all the time, they go to Google to look up information about wildlife. Google is a search engine, and it will find any information, good or bad. And so whenever you're looking for information, make sure you verify your sources on Google. Now, I will tell you, if you find tracks, and oftentimes it is very rare to see a wolf or a coyote or a cougar or any of these large wildlife, they have great senses and they take off before you ever get there. But if you find tracks in the sand or the snow or the mud, one of the big things to look for to differentiate between cat tracks and dog tracks, obviously, are these claw marks. But sometimes you won't see claw marks even with a canine. And so the other thing you could look for is the shape of this mane pad. If you look, dogs and wolves and coyotes, all the canines, their mane pad has this single hump on it, where the mane pad on a feline has this double hump. It almost forms the letter M. And so looking at tracks, it's real easy to tell whether or not you're looking at a canine or a feline. But one of the reasons I bring this up is going back to Google. I did a mountain lion track search, and it pulls up all these pictures, and you have canine, the classic canine, and they're calling them cougar tracks. And so again, the reason I bring this up is so many people just hop on Google and type in stuff and just take everything as gospel. please don't do that. Just make sure you're verifying the source of your information. Okay, moving on and sticking with what they look like. I will tell you, I had the pleasure, I had to go up to Wyoming to interview for a job about 5 years ago. And they had this wolf mount in their office. Standard old wolf, beautiful animal. I was so impressed by it. But let me just show you, I took its paw in my hand. Now I'm a pretty big guy. And look at the size of that paw in my hand. It is a big animal, completely different than a coyote or a fox. Coyotes and foxes have these really dainty paws. The wolves are nothing dainty about them. They can be some pretty formidable animals. And so sticking with being a formidable animal, what other characteristics do they have that make them what they are? So we're going to talk about their senses. If you look at how good of a hearing or how good a hearing that wolves have, is tremendous. About 16 times better than human hearing. And so that wolf howl that I played for you right at the very beginning, right after they were talking about the prostate issues, if you actually do hear a wolf howl, you could hear from a long ways off. Those wolves can hear each other oftentimes from 6 miles away all the way up to 10 miles away, especially in open territory. It doesn't sound that impressive, but if you sit here and if you have any gauge of how far away 10 miles is, think of a town nearby think of a town that's about 10 miles away from where you are sitting right now. And if a wolf howls in that town, another wolf here where you are sitting could possibly hear that. So they got tremendous hearing. Great form of communication through howling and listening for those howls. Their eyesight, they have excellent eyesight. However, having said that, they don't have the greatest of color vision. And that's determined by looking at the number of rods and cones. Those are the color sensing receptors within the eye, but they are good at detecting movement. So although they might not see the colors, if anything moves, they're gonna pick up on it really quickly. And then last but not least, their sense of smell. And I talk about this all the time in my bear presentations, but they have a sense of smell that's about 100 times better than the human sense of smell. And again, think about where you're sitting and think of someone cooking hot dogs 2 miles away. We will have no possibility of smelling those hot dogs, but if the wind is right, those wolves can smell those hot dogs from about 2 miles away. So tremendous sense of smell. So let's get into some of the behavioral characteristics of wolves. Now, most people, whenever they think of wolves and wolf behavior, there'll be some that'll think of the lone wolf, but for the most part, I hope most people think of wolf packs, that there's usually this larger group of wolves that you have to contend with. And so we all know that the centerpiece of a wolf pack is the alpha male and female. Those are the breeding pair. They're the ones that kind of control what's going on within a wolf pack. Now, you will have oftentimes some subordinate animals, subordinate adults. And so this wolf pack, again, you have the alpha male and alpha female. You could have some other adults. Most of the breeding is going to be coming from the alpha male and alpha female. Occasionally you might get a pup, but for the most part, the alpha male and alpha female are the ones that are doing the breeding and bringing in new young pups into that wolf pack. Now, how big are these wolf packs? Well, you could have a wolf pack of 2 animals, alpha male, alpha female. Some of the largest ones, you're looking at 15, 20 wolves. On average, a wolf pack is usually maybe only about 6 to 8, sometimes 10. But whenever we talk about wolves, the wolf pack is something that is very dominant within the whole function and society of wolves. It revolves around wolf packs. So how does that pack mentality influence their behavior? And so let's look at some of those behavioral characteristics of wolf packs. So first and foremost, and I think this is really cool, is those wolf packs really have an effect on the distribution of wolves across the landscape. Usually when you think of most mammals, whether or not it's deer or squirrels or anything, they're just pretty much scattered about the landscape wherever there's good habitat. When it comes to these wolves and wolf packs, they're very territorial. And so a wolf pack, like I said, it could be a couple wolves, it could be 15 to 20 with a big pack, but they defend their territory. They don't like other wolves coming into their territory. So these wolf packs really claim their spot. Now their territory, it could vary in size, anywhere from 10 square miles to 500 square miles. Now, a lot of that depends on the amount of available food. So if there's lots and lots of food or animals to eat, their territory will be relatively small. But say they're in the Southwest where some of those bigger game animals are more widely distributed, then that wolf pack is going to be a much larger wolf pack, but they will keep other wolves at bay. So this helps modulate or keeps control of how many wolves are on the landscape. So it's not like they're going to keep breeding and just go crazy with the wolves. The wolf pack helps keep a certain population level based on the amount of resources that are available. So I think that's really interesting. And if you notice, if you look at these wolf packs, there's very little overlap. And I will tell you, the thing I love, I swear, when I retire from my day job, I'm gonna take a job naming wolf packs, because I think the names of these packs are super cool. And I'm reading my screen here. There's the Loop Loop pack, the Strawberry pack, Beaver Creek pack, the Dirty Shirt pack, the Smack Out pack. And so whoever names the wolf packs, I think you got the coolest job in the world, and I like the job that you're doing. So anyway, wolf packs kind of help regulate how many wolves are on that landscape. Now, it also has an effect on how wolves hunt. Now, for those of you that don't know, and I never mentioned it or didn't mention it at all today, wolves are classified as carnivores. They eat meat to survive. They might eat a vegetable here and there, but for the most part, they are eating meat and killing animals and eating them in order to survive. And the thing is, with wolves, they have a taste for large mammals. And so if you look to see what wolves are eating, depending on where they live in North America, their main food source, it might be elk, it could be mule deer. In some areas where you find bison, they will feed on bison, especially in that Yellowstone area. They also will take down full-grown moose. It's amazing the strength they have being in a pack, and I'll explain that here in a second. Those more northern wolves up in Canada could feed quite a bit on caribou. Even those Arctic tundra wolves could feed on muskox, but for the most part, they like eating those larger animals because it gives them more bang for the buck. There's more food available if they could take down a larger animal. Now, don't get me wrong. If they see a smaller animal nearby, whether or not it's a ground squirrel, marmot, whatever, if they can catch it, they will catch it and eat it. They will eat whatever they can get their snout on. Because of that, sometimes they run into problems, because sometimes they will dine on domestic livestock, whether or not it is sheep or sometimes cattle. They will take those animals down if given the opportunity. And this is what causes a lot of conflict with wolves in North America. Now, the hunting tactic that they employ, like I say, they like those large animals. Now, a single wolf is not going to be too much match for something like an elk or a moose, but because they hunt in packs, they can bring down much larger animals. And the tactic they use, and I will tell you about another class I'm teaching in 2 weeks about predator tactics, but for the most part, they're not an ambush predator. They are a marathon predator. And so what they'll do is when they encounter a large animal, especially if it's an older, sick, or young animal, or one that's been injured, they will give chase. And once they give chase, the whole pack joins in. And what they're trying to do, because that animal is so much larger, it can cause serious damage to a wolf. One kick from that hind leg could knock out teeth, break a jaw. It could kill or severely cripple a wolf, and they don't want that. So what they want to do is weaken that animal. So they will give chase with the rest of the pack. And they keep chasing that animal. They're trying to wear it out so it's not going to put up much of a fight. Obviously, when you have a number of animals in your pack that's chasing a single animal, you can kind of take a rest while the other animals continue the pursuit. And so over time, that animal, that lone prey item, doesn't stand much of a chance. And when the pack finally moves in, there's certain ways that they will go about trying to attack and put that animal down. And again, I'm going to talk about that in a different webinar. But they're very, very efficient killers of these larger animals, whether or not it's deer or moose or elk. They can do a good job, especially if they have a strong pack. Now, one of the things that gives wolves a bad reputation, and you may have heard about it or read about it, or someone will tell you they do this all the time, is this idea of surplus killing. And there have been instances where a wolf pack has come in and killed multiple animals in a herd. I will tell you there's a lot of misinformation about that, because a lot of people say wolves kill for fun. They won't even eat it. They just kill because they like to kill. Don't believe that, folks. Even in an instance where there's surplus killing, and usually this surplus killing happens when you have a herd of animals that are trapped. They're either fenced in or they're caught in deep snow. It does not happen often, but the reason the wolves will do that, especially in the wintertime, is if they can take down a dozen, half dozen animals in one evening, they just almost ensure their survival throughout that whole wintertime, because they can feed on those carcasses, especially again in the winter, that meat will be preserved. They can feed on those carcasses for literally months on end. So it's not this big bad wolf they just like killing because they like killing. They're doing it because it's a survival tactic for them. The good thing is this doesn't happen quite often. It's rare that they can catch that many animals being trapped or stuck in snow. But when it does happen, people, the anti-wolf crowd, will use it to really paint wolves in a bad picture. So having said that, wolves have developed a reputation. Obviously, you will see photos like this, but for the most part, y'all know this. Wolves are in folklore since the day you were a little baby hearing about Little Red Riding Hood. And so it doesn't matter what culture you're in, you saw wolves dominate the Northern Hemisphere. So it doesn't matter if you're in North America, Europe, Asia, you're going to hear stories about the big bad wolf. And so it is kind of ingrained in this human psyche that these are bad animals. And I'm hoping to break that. They're not bad animals. They're just animals, and they do things different than us. Carnivores have to kill other animals in order to survive. And so I don't like seeing all this misrepresentation of wolves. Now, they are extremely intelligent animals. They'll take care of their young, defend their young, just like any other species will. One of the things that you will hear about wolves from the pro-wolf crowd is this idea of trophic cascades. And I've got a whole nother presentation you could sit through, but you have probably heard stories about how when wolves return, everything becomes perfect, and they change the course of rivers. There's a video documentary about how wolves change rivers. I will tell you, this whole concept of trophic cascades, it's really interesting. There's some science to it, but it's not as simple as that video paints the picture, where wolves come in and everything gets great again. It is so tremendously complex, these trophic cascades, because once once wolves return to the landscape, it affects other animals, and those animals affect other animals, and it's this cascading effect to create balance in the ecosystem. Anyway, it's a really cool thing. I love talking about that. I won't go into too much detail, but I am talking my head off. So I'm going to start wrapping this up. Wolves have been in the news. They're an amazing creature, very controversial creature because of everything I just mentioned. And so recently, you may have heard a couple of years ago, the people in Colorado voted. It was a vote on the state ballot for Proposition 104, and it was whether or not the state wildlife agency was going to reintroduce wolves into the state of Colorado. That ballot passed by a very narrow margin. I will say that is awful. We don't want wildlife management to be based on popular vote, because the populace does not understand the science. So people may think that's a great thing, but we hope it doesn't set a precedence that because people could vote, hey, let's release pigs everywhere, or who knows what's going to go. So although I like the idea of wolves returning to their former range, this voting by popular vote for wildlife management is something that is kind of risky. Now, since they did vote to release wolves in Colorado, the funny thing is, as they're figuring out how they're going to do that, wolves decided to migrate from Colorado, from Wyoming, they headed south and they set up camp in Colorado. So you may have heard stories about how there are now wolves in Colorado before we even released any. And so that's just natural migration, natural spread or range expansion from those wolves up in Wyoming. Now, as soon as wolves come into play, you have lots of pro-wolf people being very happy about that. And then you'll see stories about how the wolves are now killing livestock. So there is going to be a lot of good articles about wolves and a lot of negative articles about wolves. You have to take it with a grain of salt. You kind of have to know what's going on with the population, but wolves are just, people love talking about them. Like I said, they're bred into our culture. And so anything that's a wolf story will be front page news for a lot of folks. Something you may have heard about just a couple of days ago, or probably last week, I believe, is in the lower 48, the greater Yellowstone, the Midwestern wolves and the Southwestern wolves. You heard about a federal judge overturned the endangered species protections. I could talk about that for about an hour, but what it does is it restored protections on those Midwestern wolves. The Southwestern wolves were always protected, and anywhere that wolves wander outside of that greater Yellowstone ecosystem, those are protected. But the wolves in the greater Yellowstone ecosystem still don't have that endangered species protections because Congress removed those protections back in 2011. So it's complicated. Bottom line, one thing I do want people to know is wolves are not endangered globally. So don't think that they're going to be wiped off the face of the earth. Most of the endangered species talk you hear about wolves is for specific areas or specific parts of the country. Oh, and that's what I was going to show you. So these wolves are still pretty much unprotected, but the wolves in the Midwest and Southwest, all those protections are again restored because of this latest ruling by the judge. I will get back to that in a second, Jan. So let me summarize so we can start asking and answering, hopefully answering a lot of questions. Summarizing today's talk, the wolves occupy a huge range. Most of Canada, there's those pockets in the lower 48, but if you look across the world, they're all throughout Europe, all throughout Asia. And so wolves, these gray wolves, they're not in jeopardy of going extinct, but there are some locations throughout the world that we are offering protections to make sure they don't blink out. Another thing is the speciation can get very complicated because canines can cross a wolf to a coyote to domestic dog. there's a lot of questions about that. People that say they saw an animal and I know what I'm talking about because I know what a wolf looks like, or I know what a coyote looks like, or what a red wolf looks like, understand that even the professionals, when, for example, when I was in East Tennessee, when the Red Wolf Project was going on, the biologist said they often cannot tell the difference between a red wolf and a coyote, especially if they're seeing it from a distance. So when you hear people claiming, I know what I saw, we don't even know what we saw. A lot of it comes down to genetic testing, but for the most part, you can tell that an animal is mostly coyote, mostly wolf, mostly whatever. And so just understand speciation can get very, very complicated at times. Now, their social structure with the wolf packs, it's quite complex. It's very efficient. It serves them very, very well. And so whenever I think of wolves, wolf packs are never too far behind, because that's pretty much how those wolves operate and function. And there is this cultural stigma that I think it needs to be broken. We've been taught as a young child about the big bad wolf and how they're scary animals. And I pretend that they're not scary. They're just wolves. And so they belong on the landscape wherever we can support them on the landscape. But this idea that there are good animals and bad animals, I think is something we really need to stop pushing. And they truly, truly represent wild America. You hear that wolf howl in the distance and you know you're in a very, very special place. So with that, I am going to get to questions, but let me finish my slides so we can just focus on the questions. For those new folks that joined us today, if you want information on the classes that are coming up, we do have a website. We also do a podcast. We occasionally talk. In fact, the next 2 classes in March are based off a couple of the podcast episodes. But the easiest thing to do is follow us on Facebook. We have a Wildlife for You Facebook page. Go ahead and follow us there. We're always announcing classes. We're putting up different information about wildlife. But mark your calendars, and this is for everybody, because the next 2 classes I am so looking forward to. We're sticking with the predators, which is my specialty, but March 1st, 2 Tuesdays from tonight, Stephanie Payne will be joining us, but this is based off one of our podcasts, and it's going to talk about the tactics predators use to take down animals, those hunting strategies. We're going to spend a whole hour on that and go over wolves and cougars and bears, different types of predators and how they take down animals. Then the next one after that, it's a 2-part series. The next one after that is going to be the meal. How do they consume those animals? And again, wolves, bears, cougars, they do it differently. And so clues, knowing how they take down animals and knowing how they consume those animals, will tell you whenever you find a carcass in the woods, what animal was the cause of that. And so I'm looking forward to it. This is based on a couple of podcasts we did, but I hope you join us for both of those classes in March. And so you all know we do a lot of these classes. We love doing them. We're going to keep doing them. We have other experts that join us from time to time. But remember, when it comes to wildlife, your knowledge about wildlife often means their existence. So keep learning and keep educating yourself. So with that, I am here for as long as you want to answer questions. And I'm gonna laugh because I just saw someone say a ratapack. I love that name. That would be a great name for a wolf pack. Okay, I'm gonna scroll up to see if there's questions I missed prior. And Trish, I'm gonna start answering them. And if you know of a question I missed, please let me know. Jan, the wolf, I tell you what, the superimposed pic with the wolf and coyote, I will put it up on our Facebook page so you can take a closer look at it. It's a great photo. Ginny was mentioning the way to differentiate between wolves and coyotes. You can also look at the eyes. There's lots of little features you can look at to help you. But I tell you what, there are some photos I look at where, man, it's a tough determination. Okay, Susan asked a question. Do parents eventually purposefully separate from their offspring as bears do. What you'll find, Susan, especially in the mammal world, is the females raise their young. Obviously, with canines, the male and the female help raise their young. What happens is the males, the subordinate males, oftentimes they're like teenage boys. They go out to try to strike it out on their own and find their own territory. And so because of that behavior, in bears, they get kicked out, where the female bears kind of get tolerated. But for the most part, those young males will spread out, and that helps spread their genes across the landscape. So there's not a lot of inbreeding that's taking place. And so those younger wolves will definitely try to move out. Oftentimes when a wolf pack forms, you'll have this alpha male, alpha female, and some of the wolves that they take into the pack are going to be some of those exploring wolves from other packs, those subordinate males especially, but you could also have a female, and they'll come in to these other wolf packs. So there's constant shuffling. Yes, there may be a situation where a close relative sticks around and it's not ideal, but for the most part, those close relatives kind of strike out on their own, trying to form their own wolf pack. Okay, Ginger asked a great question. Is it true that the alpha wolf always walks behind his group? There was a meme. In fact, I was just looking at it a couple of weeks ago where it showed this long line of wolves in a wolf pack that was walking down a trail. And it said how the oldest wolves are in front. Then you have some subordinates. And then it had a pecking order, and it said the alpha male is always in back watching over the pack. And that is not true. They will go in lots of different orders. They're not always regimented like that. I think it was a meme that really tried playing on people's sentiment to think how wonderful wolves are, that they're watching over everyone. But no, that is not true, Ginger, that the alpha is always in the back. It depends on what's going on. The alpha might be in front. The alpha might not even be out with the other wolves at a certain time. So it's just one of the classic, I don't want to say urban legends, but misunderstandings that people have about the wolf packs. Okay, Jan asked a question about coyotes and asked, do coyotes form packs? The answer to that is yes. Now, typically coyotes are much more solitary than wolves, but coyotes can form packs. Typically, when you see a whole group of coyotes, though, you might see anywhere from 4 to 6 coyotes kind of all together. Oftentimes, Jan, that is a family group. You'll have an alpha male and an alpha female coyote. They will have young. They will raise those young. If they have a large litter, you're going to see what appears to be a coyote pack. But coyotes tend to be much more solitary than wolves. Very good question, though. All right, any others that I missed? There was a question about when I'll do a class on bears. I'm going to be releasing the schedule. We're gonna develop new classes. I've only had the classes from now until June, but the second half of the year, we're going to make sure we've got a bunch of bear classes in there because they're my favorite. Oh, Lori asked a really good question about, do you know anything about the reintroduction of wolves to Isle Royale National Park? I think I read an article about it sometime in the past, but I can't remember if it was a successful endeavor. Isle Royale is this large island up in the Great Lakes area. It's right on the Canadian border. And typically, there's debate on what the dominant prey species and what the dominant predator species was, because at one point it was believed it was lynx and caribou, but now recently it's between wolves and moose. And so the thing is, some of those, I believe moose were reintroduced to that island, Lori, and the wolves can get to that island when there is a very cold winter and the lake freezes. In fact, there were wolves. They were worried about the wolf population on Isle Royale getting too low. And so what they tried doing is supplementing that wolf population. They put some wolves out there, and then the lake froze over, and a bunch of the wolves that they put out there simply walked back across the lake. And so it's a real interesting read. I won't go into too much detail, but Isle Royale is a very interesting place in that the dynamic there is the moose control the wolves, or the wolves control the moose population. It's that predator-prey relationship, but there has been times in the past where it was a lynx caribou system at one point. So really interesting. I encourage you to look more into that. I appreciate about the Smokies. Miss you. I miss the Smokies occasionally, but I do love it out here in the West. Okay, Lori, I think your question was about Isle Royale. Well, I appreciate all the comments. I have a tendency to talk everyone's ear off. I love wildlife. I'm passionate about wildlife, and you know, predators are my forte, whether or not it's bears or cougars or wolves. So hopefully I was able to teach you something. But like I said, it's your knowledge that really helps these animals out. So don't just take my word for it. Research stuff, but if you do research stuff, make sure you're getting it from good sources. The worst source that you can get your information from is Facebook. And that's why I added a couple of slides. Is just the other day, someone was trying to educate people about coy wolves, and they were getting a lot of things wrong. And so definitely be a critical thinker, research your topic. And I want to thank everyone in attendance. And if you registered and signed up for the class through the normal means, if you're a Wildlife For You member, or if you just purchased the class, I'll send you a copy of the recording shortly after the class ends. So, all right, folks, I think we're going to call it unless there's any other questions that I missed. But I really do appreciate you, and I hope to see you at a future class. Remember, the next two are going to be about predators. I'm going to have Stephanie Payne join in. She's a pretty good predator expert herself. So let's see. All right, I'm stopping the recording.